Welcome to the Samson Strength Coach Collective. Happy Halloween, day after Halloween for those who celebrated. Hope you had a fantastic last night. I hope Halloween was everything you wish you had out of the day. Some of you who celebrated, some of you who don't celebrate, I totally understand either way. Halloween happens to be my favorite holiday. I hope you guys got all the candy and handed out good candy. I feel like every Samson Strength Coach Collective listener is probably a full-size candy bar household kind of person, which I truly believe and I feel deep down in my heart. I hope you weren't handing out fun size Snickers, Milky Ways, which, by the way, Samson has given me a platform and I will take my time. And I will say that Milky Ways kind of suck. And I apologize if I've offended anybody, but at the same time, it's just a lame Snickers. And so if you're handing out fun size Milky Ways, potentially reevaluate it. Maybe we should progress into full size candy bars. If it's a full size Milky Way, I mean, you're trying. And so I appreciate that, and so I'm sorry to start off with such aggressive take, but as I said, Samson gave me a platform and I'm going to use my platform and I'm going to speak my truth. And, Samson may come back to me and say this is too aggressive of a take, but it's just how I feel. And so I do want to speak my truth today. But that is all a distraction from the fantastic guest that we have today on this episode, Connor Schoepp. Connor Schoepp is currently the owner of Rebuild Performance and Rehab based out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Connor has an extensive history. Not only does Connor have an extensive history, he's got a great first name. Spells it the right way too, which we addressed very early on in the podcast. But he has an extensive history within collegiate and professional strength and conditioning, and has obviously built a lot of success, and is very specialized within the return to play protocols and the return to play for athletes who are injured. And I think it's a fantastic niche that he's found and something that is desperately needed within the United States, as he mentions in the podcast. So we talk about starting the business, some challenges that he faced, and then at the end of the day, what his career has looked like and what led him to start his own business. So it was really insightful. Connor was very open and honest with us. I appreciate it greatly. As always, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy. What's going on, Samson Strength Coach Collective listeners? On today's episode, we have Connor Schoepp, owner of Rebuild Performance and Rehab. Connor, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Absolutely, man. I'm very excited for this. Obviously, because I've been meaning to speak with you for a while. But honestly, the biggest thing that I'm excited about is that I think you're the first Connor I've interviewed since I
Let's
took
go.
over.
Yeah, and you actually spell it right
Yeah,
too.
and you spell it right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's always the big one. I remember when we first met at CSCCA, that was the immediate conversation because you
Yeah.
wouldn't believe. And now let me ask you this question too, just a crazy one. When you send emails, do people still send you the email with your name spelled incorrectly in like a reply?
Almost constantly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
absolutely insane, right? Like
Yeah.
the amount of times it's like I've already spelled it out and you just immediately get it wrong. It's just absolutely absurd. But
Yeah.
I thank you. I'm glad we can commiserate in the experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, let's just get right to it. Let's get right to it. Can you just give me a background of your career and then what's brought you to Rebuild Performance and Rehab?
Yeah. So started out my career undergrad at the University of Sioux Falls. Played college football, and that's kind of where I started my interning career with the school there. I bounced around a couple of private facilities, a couple of high schools, tactical side a little bit, and then went on to intern at Colorado State with football. Wake Forest men's and women's basketball, Miami football, Mississippi State football. Got my first full-time role at the University of Pitt, which is part of the reason I ended up back here in Pittsburgh. Pretty quickly after that, though, I ended up back in Mississippi State as the associate director. Got let go after the season. Staff got cleared out, so ended up going to the Olympic side for a short bit. Then COVID hits, which was really cool because they kind of got rid of everything. A lot of schools shut down. But best thing about that is I got to go to Arizona with the Cardinals for the 2020 season. Intern with them, which was a life-changing experience for me. Went home to the private sector for just a little bit. Wasn't really feeling it. Still in the middle of COVID. Still knew I wanted to get back in the college side of things. Had an opportunity to go to Liberty University where I would be the director of sports science and also a performance coach. And that's where I spent the last 3 years until about 2 months ago, where I recently just stepped away to move back up to Pittsburgh to start Rebuild Performance and Rehab.
That's awesome. Well, let me ask you this. What made you so comfortable with being able to move around so much? I know that's kind of like one of the main hesitancies when I speak about with young strength coaches about the profession. Like, what made you just okay with being able to move, going from Arizona, Mississippi State, Pittsburgh, and just, kind of being fluid with where your home base is?
Yeah, man, it was fun. It was really cool, and it was something I always tell myself like it was really fun to do while I was young. I would never do that again. I would never do that now. Um, but for me, man, I was just and this is like one of the things that I tell a lot of young strength coaches, and something that I'm really glad that I bought into early on in kind of my development was just the idea of like chase development, not opportunities. Right. I think as a young strength coach, and it's obviously different for everybody, right? Like everybody has different financial situations, different expectations of their life or what they want out of the career. But I was just fortunately enough to be in a position where you know I could just find the best people, in my opinion, at the time to go learn from and grow under. Because I knew eventually those are the things that would help me get to where I want to get to. Now it was definitely a longer path, and having to move all that, all those times and all those short periods, and having to constantly restart relationships and things like that. Like, yeah, it was tough, but at the same time, like looking back on it now, I got so lucky and I was so fortunate to be around so many great people, so many great practitioners, and get to learn from, so many cool people. And if it weren't for those experiences, there's no way I'd be where I'm at now.
I think that's the really interesting piece about moving around so much too is you don't really realize how good you start to become at the developing relationships aspect because you've had to do it so many times over and over again. You don't really realize that one of your specialties ends up becoming how to make an impact quickly, and then all of a sudden you maybe at your fourth or fifth spot and you realize, hey, this is a lot easier than it was the first couple times that we did it.
Oh, day and night. Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, like I said, I don't recommend it to everybody. It was not the funnest or the easiest way to go about things, but it is pretty amazing the lessons you kind of learn along the way, and how much you kind of learn about yourself. I spent the first 22 years of my life in South Dakota, growing up there and then playing college football there. It was great, but that was also part of it in the sense of like, you know, getting to go out and experience the country a little bit and see all those different things and learn a lot about that, but also myself kind of at the same time. It was a cool experience.
Yeah, you kind of lit up just a little bit when you spoke about the Cardinals. What made that experience so interesting for you?
Yeah, man. So that one specifically was super cool. Obviously, a lot of people are familiar with the name Buddy Morris in the field. Buddy's been coaching literally longer than I've been alive. And in terms of like people that I consider mentors, I kind of chased that for a long time. I didn't really have a whole lot of people. I worked with a lot of great coaches, but I never really had anyone kind of stick their neck out for me, and really go out of their way to develop me and try to help me further develop my career until I came to Mississippi State. And there was a guy by the name of Anthony Paroli. Anthony Paroli's from Pittsburgh, worked at Pitt with Buddy, spent 4 years with the Cardinals with Buddy, before I ended up taking that Mississippi State job. And just so happened to turn out that we ended up there at the same time, and we hit it off. And he was somebody that had a huge impact on me. And then after kind of all these moves and getting to work in Mississippi State and then Pitt, I was fortunate enough because of my relationship with Anthony that he got me to go intern with his mentor, Buddy. So it was kind of one of those things where it was like, I learned all these things. I learned this system of development, got really close with this guy, and then I had the opportunity to go learn from the guy that taught him everything that he knew, right? And when I got there, yeah, it was a great experience. Like obviously the NFL is a really cool place to be. You get to see, the best athletes in the world in the best environments, competing and all these different things that go into it, that you kind of dream about, I think, as a young strength coach or even just like a sports fan. But I think more importantly, getting to work for a guy like Buddy was so cool. Just being able to see how someone like that operates. From day one, he treated me nothing but a peer. Treated me with respect, gave me responsibilities, and really showed me, I think, like what it was that I kind of wanted to be as a strength coach, in terms of demeanor, in terms of how I treated people, in terms of how I continued developing myself and my athletes. Like it was really one of those kind of pivotal moments in my career where it was like, had I not had that opportunity, I don't think I would still be in this field. So just kind of fortunate how that worked out.
Those are just the most valuable experiences for you, right? Like that one, especially with moving around a lot. I can identify with that too, just because, right before we started the show, you asked me if I'm from North Carolina, and I was like, no, I've been I've been everywhere at this point, right?
Yeah.
But each position is going to hold a different value to you, and it's also going to hold a little bit different of a love for the field, right? Some make you love the field just a little bit further. Some make you kind of distance yourself from it just a little bit. So, to be able to hear that you enjoyed the Cardinals so much. And then what I think is really cool too, right, is to be able to learn from your mentor's mentor. That's a rare experience. And obviously, like with Bill Starr teaching Craig Fitzgerald, who was the first strength coach I worked for, like if I had the opportunity
Hmm.
to meet Bill Starr, I'd lose my mind, right? Or Gail
Yeah.
Hatch, or all these guys who, influenced my career greatly, but they have no clue that they did.
Oh yeah, it's crazy, man. And it even goes farther back. Like when I was in college, man, I was an awful student. I pretty much sit on the back and stare at my computer the whole time during class. But I used to read these message boards, these old message boards where Buddy was right as this guy by he'd go by Coach X. Um, and to be honest, like I didn't really know who Buddy Morris was at the time. I just knew him as this Coach X guy, but I loved his stuff at the time. And then it's just like fast forward 10 years later, and it's like get the opportunity to work under him and observe him and get to know him. Man, it was yeah, it's definitely like a full circle moment.
That's exactly, you took the words out of my mouth. That was exactly what I was about to say. Well, now take me to rebuild performance in rehab. What was the main driving force for you to start your own business, and then what does that business exactly entail?
Yeah, so I think it was a lot of things, right? So, like I said, I spent kind of the last decade working in the college and professional environment, and it was great and an experience that I wouldn't trade for anything else. I certainly wouldn't be in the position now if I hadn't gone through that experience. But I think I faced a lot of the similar challenges that a lot of other coaches face in our field, right? And I think it's important that we talk about them just because, like, I think it's a reality that doesn't get brought up enough. Of like, I had the financial struggles, I had the burnout, right? I put myself in the hospital a couple times. You know, uh, all these different things. Not getting along with sport coaches, administration battles. A lot of those things, right? And that just kind of comes with the job, right? Like that is kind of a part of it, unfortunately. And my situation is not special to anyone else's, but it was just kind of one of those things where it started to wear on me really, really hard, and it got to the point where I started to kind of lose the joy in what I was doing, and that's kind of where I knew something needed to change, right? And I think for the longest time, and like something that I really struggled with was this idea of just like constantly chasing the next role, right? Like I think it's so easy in our field to just kind of chase this dragon of like, oh, well, like the next role is going to be the best one. And once I get there, everything else is going to be fine, right? Like I'll get more money, I'll be at a higher level, I'll be able to do all these things. Then it's like, I kind of got to a point, man, where it was like, I kind of already did that, right? Like I was 25-year-old assistant strength conditioning coach in the SEC and like, thought I was on top of the world. And then I got there and realized like, oh, this maybe isn't everything it was cracked up to be, right? And that's not to say it was a bad place or bad people or anything like that. It was just kind of the reality of it is like you can't just continue to chase that because it's kind of an never ending journey, right? And so all that to say is that like during my time at Liberty, and this was the best thing that probably came out of that experience was I realized like my true passion was return to play, right? And I would just tell myself like, hey, I'm going to go get this big time job, and then once I'm done with that, um, I'm just going to go full time return to play. I love it. It's what gives me passion. I think there's a niche for it in the field and a need for it, especially in the private environment. And it just got to the point where like I'd missed out on enough opportunities and I'd gotten close and close. But because of kind of where I was at, I realized like I could just go do this right now, right? Like there's nothing stopping me from just stepping away and going pursuing that kind of with everything I got, right? I couldn't wait any longer to do something. I don't want to say special with my life, and not that what I was doing wasn't special, but maybe just something that was more fulfilling for me and kind of where I was at in my career. right? So I guess just for me, it was kind of one of those things I just realized like, hey, like, all I want to do is return to play. That's what gives me joy. That's, what I'm passionate about. Like, well, let's just go do it. Unfortunately, I'd been dating my girlfriend. She had, we had met when I was here at Pitt. She was from here. I knew what I wanted to do would probably be best off in a big city. Um, and so, yeah, I just kind of pulled the trigger and 2 months ago decided to move up here and, go all in on it. And so for me, what Rebuild is, it's primarily a focus on end stage return to play, right? So just this idea of like injury happens, in a traditional model, there's this, extended period of time of passive treatment. They spend a lot of time in the training room, sports medicine. Um, and then as they get closer to these kind of predetermined timelines, they get handed off to the sport coaches and they get this like super fast rising edge and, hyper specific loading. Um, and it's a bad system right now, right? And a system that I think a lot of people face. And so for me, it's just my idea is just like, being able to be that person that bridges that gap between injury and performance, and being able to fill in some of those holes and prepare athletes for the demands of their sport and help them return sooner and more efficient at a more robust level. Is kind of what it's all about. So hopefully get that off the ground here soon.
Well, first of all, major brownie points, I'm sure, with your girlfriend being able to move right back to Pittsburgh, right?
Yeah.
That's always nice at the end of the day. It's tough to explain to your significant others that you don't really get to determine where the next job is going to come up in the collegiate or professional sector. But I think it's really interesting how you addressed not only the challenges of coaching, but also like how many of them exist and how many different areas that they can come from. And it feels like sometimes when I speak with other college coaches, it's like, you brought up about five, and I can think of it's like, okay, well, at this specific school, I maybe have one of those five challenges, and then my buddy's dealing with four of those five challenges, right? And it's every job, like you mentioned too, has their ups and downs, and there's drawbacks to every position, no matter what field you're in. But at the end of the day, like I do think it is a little bit of a messed up system that we're kind of just like, well, maybe I don't have it as bad as somebody else, right? I get along with my head coach, but admin doesn't really have my back, so I can just kind of deal with this one thing. And then exactly like you mentioned too, you feel like you can just go to the next step and you feel like you can go to the next school and everything will just get better and all the problems will be solved. I compare it sometimes with my friends to like, a couple who's in a bad way ends up having a baby or getting married because they think it'll kind of fix their situation that they're in. And it's just like, well, you kind of just anchored yourself a little bit more to something that you didn't necessarily love. And so it's a cost benefit analysis of what you're going to be able to put up with. But like, you mentioned, I mean, and we don't have to speak about this if you don't, but like going into the hospital a couple times, like what was that burnout for you?
Yeah, it was a lot of things, man, and a crazy experience, and one that I definitely put myself in one too many times. I guess the biggest one was I was at so I'll rewind a little bit. I was at Pitt. I was training, trying to do stuff I definitely shouldn't have been doing. It basically just blew out my back. L4, L5 herniation, stenosis, had sciatica going down both legs, couldn't sit in a chair. And I was just grinding through my job, right? Like, you know how it is, and pretty traditional on the football side of things. Like, it's 12-hour days, it's long days, sitting down, moving stuff. It was a grind. And then I ended up going back to Mississippi State, and it's kind of a crazy story, man. We're going through the season. My back is getting worse and worse. I've exhausted pretty much everything I do. I'd reach out to like every specialist in the country. That I could get a hold of, trying to get second opinions, doing all these MRIs and things like that. And then it basically just got to the point where I was like, hey, like surgery is the only option and your best option at this point. So I was like, cool, well, we weren't doing so hot. And so like, I didn't really know if we were even going to get retained. Right. And so we're getting closer and closer to this end of the season. And I'm like, if I get a surgery now, like I can't go get another job if we get let go. Right. And so I'm in this kind of awkward spot. We don't really know what's going on. And we get to our last game of the year. Administration basically tells us straight up, like, hey, we win this game against our rival Ole Miss. You get to keep your jobs. I'm like, cool. All right. So we schedule the surgery. I figure out, like, all right, if we win, I'll get it. If not, I'll hold off. Well, we end up winning the game. 2 days later, I get my surgery. We're all set. Um, Turns out the surgery didn't take it all. It made things so much worse. We end up going to our bowl game. We end up getting our ass kicked by Louisville, and we get let go the next day by a text. Right. So here I am, basically on disability. We just got let go from our jobs unexpectedly, and I'm out of a job. And it was tough, man. Fortunately, I was at a place where, they let me hang on the Olympic side for a little bit, but not 2 months later in that March is when COVID hit. My position gets cleared out, and now I'm back home in South Dakota living in my parents' basements on disability, just trying to kind of stay alive, right? And so all that to say, it ended up working out for the best. I wouldn't have gotten to Arizona or gotten to do all these other things if it had not been for that situation. But definitely one, man, if there's a young strength coach out there, like if there's one sentiment that I can share with you is like, and it's corny, but I think it's corny for a reason, is you can't take care of other people unless you take care of yourselves. And that is just kind of one of those things where I completely missed the boat on, and really hurt a big chunk of my life.
Oh my goodness! Yeah, holy shit! That's all I have to say. I mean, really, like, that's it's an insane story, but it's also, I mean, it just brings back other stories I can hear about from other coaches. It's not an uncommon situation as well, too. Like the physical
Yeah.
health aspect, I feel like isn't mentioned a ton with strength and conditioning. Like I remember, I mean, I was a GA, or I was a part-time assistant, and I had
Mhm.
cheerleading, and I had an abscess, and I couldn't walk. And I was like, well, I still got to run my group this morning, and I'll go to the hospital after that. Right.
Yeah.
And like, it's insane what the expectation is. And sometimes it's not from others, it's just from ourselves, because you want to do the best job possible. And especially when you're a younger strength coach, you're fighting for your job, right? You're trying to make sure that you can say, hey, I'm here for the team. But at the same time, like any other profession, you're probably taking sick leave or disability leave, right? So you can actually get this done, and you know that you have a job to come back to. Like I remember too, I went to the hospital after with that abscess, and they were like, if you waited another day, like this could have, put you at serious risk, and you potentially could have died. And
Yeah.
I didn't even click to me in that moment. It took me years after to really understand like how stupid that was. So the physical health aspect, I feel like, isn't mentioned very much at all. So I mean, I appreciate you sharing your story.
Yeah, no, man, it is way more common and far too common. It's tough, and it's one of those things that I think we're getting better at as a field. Like I do think we're starting to understand that, at the end of the day, this is a job. At least I like to think so. But we definitely still have a long ways to go, and one that I kind of hope to see it get better sooner than later for sure.
Absolutely. Well, so you mentioned that, the return to play process is what you're truly passionate about. When you look at return to play processes, across the board, and this is going to be a very general question, like what are the main errors that you typically see?
Oh man, yeah, that's a good one. So I would say, in terms of like return to play as a whole, right? I would say the biggest issues that I see is just a lack of communication, right? You have all these. Anytime there's an injured athlete, there's all these different kind of stakeholders that make up this group of people surrounding the athlete, right? And the athlete being one of them. But you have your sports medicine staff, you have administration, you have sport performance, you have the sport coaches, you have the athlete, right? And there's all these different people. Either doing their part, not doing their part, you know, oftentimes not communicating well enough or efficiently enough to put the athlete in the best position possible to get back to their sport, safely and efficiently in a timely manner, right? And in the classical model, like, and this is what I see generally in the college environment, especially, is there's kind of like three scenarios, right? There's, from a strength coach perspective, there's a strength coach that, hey, this athlete is injured, you don't touch them, right? They're gone. All right, you'll get them back when they're cleared. Cool, right? I'd like to think we're past that for the most part as a field. I still see it happen way too often, but it is what it is. Two, there's the one where, okay, you can work with the athlete, but it's really just modified training, right? Like, yes, you get to have them in the room. Yes, you get a couple exposures a week with them, but you know, you have a very strict, restrictions on what you're able to do with them, or maybe you don't have any restrictions at all, and there's just not a whole lot of communication. And the third one, and where I think we need to start to kind of move this thing as a field, is being integrated from the start and being able to be inside, and involved those conversations from day one, right? So like for me, return to play starts as soon as the injury occurs, right? And regardless of the injury, regardless of the circumstances, there's no reason that we shouldn't be having conversations with all those stakeholders in some form or capacity, um, to make sure that we're at least all on the same page and that we're setting out some sort of system to help get this athlete back, right? And I think like the hard part is like that system is going to look different for everybody depending upon the situation you're in, right? Like I know you work in basketball, like I'm sure you and your trainer are locked in at the hip, right? Like you guys are talking constantly. You're at practice, he's at lifts, and then there's some coaches out there with 5 teams that have 200 athletes, and maybe that their conversation is just an email. I don't know, right? Like it's going to be a little bit different depending upon where you're at, but the most important thing is that you're just having those conversations and that you're setting some sort of clear guidelines in how we're going to get this athlete back. Because I think far too often what I see with injured athletes is they just get washed to the wayside and kind of forgotten about by everybody. Um, and that's where I see poor return to play, kind of unravel.
What about the psychological aspect that you just mentioned at the end as well? Like it's something where it's very easy to push a player off to the side or just, I mean, I'm guilty of it myself. If we have a player who had a long-term surgery, typically they'll be with the intern for the lift so that I can spend the rest of my time really making sure that I'm all eyes on the rest of the team. What do you approach and how do you approach the psychological aspect of return to play?
Yeah, so that's one that I don't think probably gets talked about enough. I think especially in long term rehab scenarios where athletes are going to be separated from their sport and their team for an extended period of time. Um, Man, it's tough, and it's a situation you kind of just talked about of like, as a performance coach, and especially as a sport coach, like the reality is like it's your job to get the people ready to play the game that are going to be out on the court, right? And that doesn't mean you don't care any less about the kid. That doesn't mean you're not concerned about their health, their well-being, or their psychological state. But the reality is like you have a job to do, and you can only spread yourself so many different ways. I think as strength coaches, though, is like I think that's where we can have a huge impact on that process, right? So I think like athlete gets injured, they get separated from their team. There's a loss of identity, right? Like some of these kids, I think, just pour their identity into this sport. Like that's who they become. They kind of get banished to the training room. Um, then you start to like add in like the hormonal imbalances, the psychological stressors, the anxiety of it all. There's a lot of things that I think present like a pretty broad challenge. And I think for us as strength coaches, like we can serve so much of a gap kind of in that role and help with that piece just by keeping engaged with the athlete, making sure that they're staying around the team, making sure that they're returning to training in a timely process. Like that's a big one for me of just like, even from a hormonal perspective and keeping athletes in what I call like a performance mindset, to me is just so valuable. And instead of like, it's tough to say, but I think the reality of it is like oftentimes we let these athletes kind of victimize themselves and just, seclude themselves and, they go to rehab and they do all these things. Like, man, I think you're just setting the athlete up for so much failure from that standpoint. And again, just, our ability to kind of bring them back, keep them involved, keep them engaged, both physically and psychologically. I don't think you can explain how much value that brings to that athlete.
I like that you use the word banished, right? Because
Yeah.
that's almost how the athlete can kind of approach it sometimes. But then also, I think exactly what you mentioned it has to be a tough love sort of balance, right? There has to be a moment where it is still based around performance. It is still based around let's making sure that you can do the most that you can possibly do, and let's not feel sorry for ourselves, right? I mean, I remember early on in my career being kind of confused about that aspect and thinking like, hey, let me give this person a break, right?
Mhm.
And we had somebody, we were doing some aerobic intervals on the assault bike yesterday, and he led up at 2:59 when it was supposed to be 3 minutes, right? And like if I was
Yeah.
a younger coach, I'd probably be like, well, he's kind of been in a tough spot. Let me kind of let him go. And instead, now with more experience, I immediately jumped on him and I was like, hey man, we're a give up at 2:59 kind of guy. Like, oh my bad, I thought we were better. Right? So
Mhm.
still presenting in a way where I'm not being a total jerk to him, but at the same time, like there has to be a tough love. There has to be somebody who can end up being somebody who can drive them and show them that it's not like everything is just going to be easier for you or everybody's just going to feel sorry for you, because eventually you're going to go back out onto the court, onto the field, and you're going to have to compete against others who don't care at all what your injury history is.
Yeah.
So I think it's a very intricate balance to play, but I think it ultimately can completely change a rehab setting and a rehab schedule.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think like I've been doing return to play for long enough now to where like, especially if I'm around the team and I know the kid, like I have a pretty good idea of how the rehab is going to go just based upon the kid's psychological state. I don't think I can speak enough to that of like, your high anxiety kids, um, kids with maybe a little bit less, emotional intelligence, emotional stability, whatever you want to call it. I'm not a psychologist, but it's very evident about like how important your mindset is into that process and how much of an impact that we can have on it just by doing exactly what you said of holding kids accountable, keeping them in a performance mindset, and like keeping it in perspective of like if you're going to play sports, and like this is a conversation I don't think enough coaches in general have with their athletes, like if you play sports long enough, like you're going to get injured, right? I think some kids have this idea of just like you know as long as I do, what I'm supposed to do, like I'm going to be all good, right? Like that's just not how it works, man. Like when you're chasing outputs, when you're trying to win, when you're kind of trying to like continue to raise that, level of competition and work and everything that you're trying to do as a team, kids are going to get hurt, right? And we can do everything we can to mitigate those things, but it's a reality. I think a lot of kids need to do a better job of understanding, and we need to do a better job as coaches of explaining those realities to them.
Yeah, that's it's something too. I think strength coaches place a lot of weight on themselves, because if somebody does get hurt, I mean, it's hard for anybody not to immediately think that it was your fault, right? Oh, if we had
Right.
just done this, then we could have avoided this situation, right? Because you care. But at the end of the day, those things just happen, and it's almost exactly like we talked about with strength coaches earlier. It's like expecting a strength coach expecting you to go to the next position and everything's going to be absolutely amazing. Something's going to go wrong at some point. So how do you handle that adversity? So where do you come in this process, especially within the private sector? Because, like you said, I think that's a specific niche. I think it's something rare that I really haven't seen a lot of coaches implement. How would you implement that within the private sector?
Yeah, so for me specifically, I look at return to play as uh, it's a spectrum, right? I think like it's like one of my principles in training and rehab is everything lives on a spectrum, general to specific, simple to complex, isolated, integrated, so on and so forth, right? Like slow to fast, short to long, yada yada yada. We all know this. For me in rehab, and what that looks like is I think it lives on a spectrum of restoration, preparation, and realization, right? Like that's where everything starts out at. Underneath that lives long term rehab, where you're talking about being out several months. For me, I've created like a criterion based system of 1 to 6 phases. And then above or below that, there's short term rehab where you're looking at several weeks, 1 to 3 phases, but they're all along that same spectrum, right? So it's the same commonalities, it's the same themes with under that entire spectrum, um, just based upon the individual and the athletes and the injury, right? And then from there, every injury that I work with is going to have a criterion based system built out on the front end to kind of help them build them out throughout that process, right? So those criterion based systems are going to be made up of phases, like I mentioned before, either 1 to 3 or 1 to 6. Each one of those phases is going to have objective markers and methods that we're going to focus on kind of throughout each phase. And then exit criteria for each phase made up of subjective and objective uh, markers to help us progress them kind of appropriately throughout that process, not based on prehistorical timelines, but based upon how that athlete is responding to training, um, and how they are responding as an individual as opposed to somebody else or something like that. Now, how does that look in the private sector? I think it's kind of all over the place. I'll get kids in late stage rehab where it's like, hey, I just spent 3 months with a you know PT. My insurance ran out. I'm nowhere near ready. Like, I need to work with you. I'll get some kids day one post op. And then maybe I'll just get a kid like, hey, I'm 2 years down the road. My knee still never felt the same. Where are we at kind of in this process? So I think it's a very dynamic and fluid process. But again, I just think it's so important. The good thing about having those systems in place on the front end gives me a home base to kind of work from and kind of take athletes in that kind of down that continuum regardless of where I kind of get them at in that process.
For those subjective measures, do you rely on technology?
Objective measures, yes. So the technological pieces, you're going to have
Objective, sorry,
certain.
yes, sorry, my
Yeah,
apologies.
yeah, yeah. So for each one of those objective measures, you're going to be, the technological piece I think is huge. But it's not just technology either, right? So like for me, I break up testing into isolated and dynamic testing. So isolated being um, isolated strength testing. This could be something as simple as body weight. This could be, thigh girth measurements. This could be, um, you know, body comp, right? Or working at like dynamic testing, which would be your counter movement jumps, your single leg counter movement jumps, your 5-10-5, your fly 10, whatever it is. Ideally, you have some sort of, prehistorical data to work from. But the reality is, in my environment, I'm getting these kids and seeing them for the first time in my life. So, being able to create standard of benchmarks of where that athlete is, what sport they play, what position they play, what age they're at, what is their training age, getting an idea of those things, kind of, and then also just being able to look at the other limb, I think is invaluable, right? But to go back to that, each one of those tests that we run from a symmetrical standpoint, we're looking at certain asymmetry thresholds kind of throughout that return to play process. So generally, it's going to be something like, greater than or equal to 30% before we can start the return to run process. 15% before we can start to get deeper into the technical tactical piece of the sport preparation, and then less than or equal to 10% if we're trying to actually get them back onto the field participating with their team.
And so, I mean, I can tell from this conversation you're a very well thought out guy. I think people just from social media can see that, right? And especially with your development of systems. And so, I'm sure you didn't go into this process, just saying, "Hey, let me start my own business one day, and that'll be really cool."
Yeah.
Uh, was there anything that was surprising to you, or any surprising challenges that you faced when you first opened up the business, and then now as you've kind of progressed into that 2 month period?
Everything. It's so funny, man, because like I am. Yeah, like I'm well thought out in the sense that I need systems to give myself structure because if I don't have structure, I am all over the place. Like if you ask anyone that knows me, I'm high anxiety, I'm high ADHD. I'm like, my office is an absolute mess right now. I get yelled at it constantly by my girlfriend. Uh, so because of that, I've had to create these systems and these structures and do all these things, and that's great in the coaching world because especially in the college and the team environment where it's like I know I get my athletes at this time, I know I get them throughout this block, I know to some extent at least what they're going to be doing in practice, right? You can create like pretty logical and pretty like layered out linear progressions and systems for all these things, right? Coming over to the business side of things, in my idea is like, oh, like I'm just gonna find a spot and we'll start rehabbing and training kids and like, all right, let's roll, right? And then there's so many different things you don't think about of like, okay, having to get a new CPA, learning to write things off, opening up an LLC, trying to find space and like what those things look like, business insurance, how are you going to market yourself, what area do you need to be in, um, so I would really just say it was the entire process of just like, man, I had spent so much of my career focusing on just becoming a better practitioner and being a better coach and a better person that this business side of the thing is a whole different aspect and a skill set that I really had no idea about. And something that I wish I would have scaled myself out more in my development of looking into it a little bit more because it has definitely been a punch in the mouth. But at the same time, it's been cool being able to kind of, drink from the fire hose and go all in on it.
Well, I mean, that seems like kind of the theme of your career, right? Is just having to understand and learn on the fly. Um, but on the flip side of that, was there anything that was surprisingly easy for you when starting?
Man, I think about this and so the cool thing about this little hiatus here is that in like doing what I do on social media and like reaching out to all these people and having all these conversations, I got to connect with a lot of really cool people that kind of do what I do, or at least something similar on the private side of things. Um, and I'm asking them all these questions and doing all these things, and I'm like, in my mind when I got into this, man, I thought about it, was like, oh, it's all about marketing and space and where you're at and how you can sell yourself and all these things. And those things are important. But just about every single coach and practitioner that I talked to said the exact same things. None of those things are what's going to ultimately make or break your business. What's going to ultimately make or break your business is one, the relationships that you're able to develop with the people around you, right? The best advertising is just, quality word of mouth and working with those people. And two, being able to provide a really high quality product. And so that was cool for me just because, like, you know, that's college strength conditioning in a nutshell, right? Can you develop your athletes? Can you develop amazing relationships with the people around you? And so it was just cool for me to like be able to like sit back and be like, oh wow, like yes, this is a new venture. Yes, this is a different thing. But at the end of the day, like, man, if you can develop relationships and help people, that's really what it's all about.
Yeah, it's so interesting because exactly what you just mentioned, right? Some of the things about starting your own business play directly into a history within collegiate strength and conditioning, right? Like you said, the relationship development and actually developing a high quality product and making sure that you implement that. But then, we never did any marketing classes in undergrad. We never did anything about how to actually start your own business.
Yeah.
And it's so funny because I'll speak with coaches who are in their 40s, right? And they're kind of in that weird frame where some of them are like, "Well, I've been doing it for so long. Why would I do anything else?" And I can't do anything else at this point, right? And it's interesting with that range too because they're not very familiar with social media. They don't really like posting on social media, right? Like it was something that's kind of lame. Whereas now with coaches, kind of within our age range, it's a lot more commonly accepted, and it's actually I'll encourage other coaches to post and do all these things that will eventually help them out. And so it's just a very, very intricate balance, I'm sure, with just starting your business and understanding, what can you actually do when you are a collegiate strength coach to help expand your opportunities in the future. I talked with Rochelle. Pojednik a couple weeks ago, and she just talked about how she bounced around from different position to position because eventually those things all taught her exactly what she needed to do to get to her final position. Looking down the line, like what would be the ideal vision for you with this rebuild performance and rehab? What would be like wow, I made it and I got exactly what I wanted out of this process?
I would say down the road, and it's funny because somebody asked me this the other day and I had no idea what to say, but I've had some time to think about it now. I would say down the road, I would love to get to a point where I am only working return to play cases. I'm only taking on cases that interest me, um, that can afford me the lifestyle that I want, afford me the balance that I want. And then I'm able to pass along kind of that process and that mentorship to other coaches that want to do what I want to do. Right. So like mentorship is something that's like really important to me. And I
Mhm.
think a word that gets tossed around a lot. Like I think people like, they have interns and they say that they mentored them, but did they actually go about, helping them develop as people, develop as coaches and develop as, their career? I think it's said a lot more than it's actually done. And so for me in doing this thing where there's not many people that do what I do, especially in the States, right? Like you see it on the soccer side a little bit. There's some rehab coach positions, but other parts of the world, it's really really popular, and it's popular because I think there's a demand for it, right? Like we all see this gap between injury and performance, and the field's going to go one way or the other. Either sports medicine will move over to it, sport performance will move over to it, or there'll be a brand new position for it. I don't know where that'll be. I don't know how it'll go. But the point being is, like, I really do think that there is a niche in this field, kind of for that role. And man, if I wish I could have had somebody along the way to kind of help guide me, um, towards it, because it's been fun like getting to kind of do this thing on my own, and having to find people to learn from and do all these things, and I've been really really fortunate. But at the same time, like, man, if I could put myself in a position to have this business in a place to where I could help other coaches kind of chase that dream of bridging that gap, for me that's kind of what it's all about.
Yeah, the mentorship piece to me is obviously very important. I think it's the most fun aspect of strength and conditioning, and exactly like you mentioned, right? Like it's fun to learn all this stuff on your own, but like when you got a little bit of advice from a mentor and it kind of helped you avoid a bad situation, that's always like the most amazing thing possible, right? It's the best gift that they can give you. And I even think about my GA who currently works with women's basketball, right? Like he ended up doing a couple of things this week that I was like, man, you're really learning and you're really growing. And I haven't told him that yet, obviously, because why would we celebrate him, right? Just
Yeah.
kidding. I'll tell him eventually. But it was really really fun for me to see that process and see him get better, because the trial by fire aspect is fun, but at the end of the day, like it doesn't have to be all miserable. It doesn't have to be constant failure. Like if you could have somebody to help you out with maybe just one or two things, it certainly helps just a little bit and makes it a little bit easier for you.
No, no question, man. I had some awesome interning experiences and I had some awful interning experiences. And that's a reality, I think, for a lot of strength coaches. Like, there's some great people out there to go learn from. There's some not so great people out there to go work from. And I think about the people that were great to me and did put me in a position to succeed and were, that kind of light that kept me in the field and kept me pursuing this thing. Man, I cannot begin to say how much of a positive impact they've had on my life.
Mm. And then, like you said, the people skills too. That's the most important. And I remember sitting down with who we talked about early on, right? Dan Worth at Tennessee, and he
Hmm.
was like, "Yeah, man. So like, you needed Roth IRA. You need to invest in it. You need to not just rely on this retirement and all those things." I mean, I've took with me, and I was blessed to be able to meet him. So it certainly made a difference within my life. Well, Connor, man, I really appreciate you coming on, dude. It's been really fun for me to get to know you better, right? And a fellow Connor was always fantastic to see another Connor be successful, right? Representing the name well. But for those of us who are listening and want to make sure that they follow up or can look into your business a little bit more or follow you on social media, what would be the best way to do that?
Yeah, pretty active on Instagram, Twitter, at rebuild PR underscore, both Instagram and Twitter. Please reach out if there's anything I can do to help you getting into the field, pursuing your career, return to play stuff. Feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Connor. I really appreciate you, man.
Yeah, thanks, man.